Hello again, and welcome to the Swindle. So, I'm trying to make smaller videos because these are quite time-consuming to upload with my fairly modest upload speeds. But I wanted to make some videos where I actually talked, because apparently that's helpful and soothing, and some people like it, so that's what we're doing. In this case, I didn't have anything to talk about, and I was told that I could talk about anything, and, well, I know I can talk about anything, but without a particular direction, it can be very awkward. You just wind up kind of vamping, and I'm not very comfortable doing that, especially because I know that I'm prone to babbling nonsense the best of times, and it's really annoying for anyone who has to put up with it. What's more, there's a lot of, like, guarded language you have to use when you're being thoughtful. Like, I might let slip, not as it were a racist slur or anything like that, but I might sit here going bums or bums and bums over and over again, and that's just not interesting to listen to. So, what I've done is I went to a website that offers supposedly conversation starters, and it has some incredibly dark suggestions for things that'll just get the ball going, as it were. So I'm not going to answer questions from it like, are you afraid to die? But it did suggest this time, do you play any sports? And this is a super interesting question because it has both a fairly standard, typical set of meanings, but it also ties into some of the stuff I talk about academically. So the simple answer to the question is no, I don't play any sport right now. I'm not a member of any teams. I don't go out with the boys and girls and play some cricket. It's just not my thing. Never has been. I played for school. At my first extremely weird school, and if I start talking randomly about events in my life based on what this website is suggesting, odds are really good we're going to wind up talking about my school life. But then I played hockey. Floor hockey. I wasn't particularly amazing at it. I had some pride in doing as well as I did at it, but I wasn't in any way remarkable. But I played hockey. I played goalie. This was apparently due to a bullying situation. This meant that I was kept physically away from other students, and it minimized stress for administrative staff who didn't want to deal with, stopping other kids from hurting me. This just also meant I got a lot of things shot at me very hard. But you do what you do. But when it comes to sport, it's a really interesting thing because sport is kind of tricky to academically define. I bring him up a lot because he's kind of foundational, even in ways that I think are probably a bit wrong. But Wittgenstein was fond of pointing out that the inability to define a game was proof that you couldn't define anything. And the subsequent follow-ups in academia on that front are, one, from Bernard Suits, who said, you just weren't trying very hard, and from Ian Bogost, who uses a model of philosophy called object-oriented ontology, which basically, object-oriented ontology is the idea that just because we can't objectively define anything doesn't mean we can't define anything. It means that everything we talk about is itself anchored to a raft of other metaphorical things. The glib way I summarized this in my thesis was it's metaphors all the way down, which isn't wrong. It's just a somewhat simplified way of describing his position. The idea of object-oriented ontology is explored most in depth in Bogost's book Alien Phenomenology, or What It's Like to Be a Thing, a book which also, in addition to this fairly useful and interesting discussion, includes one of the most fabulously irritating philosophical positions I've ever had to deal with, which is when it comes to time to define words in academia, sometimes you just gotta put a word out there that you can use. And this meant that, for example, you did wind up with the invention of the term paratext by Gerard Genette, another term I've used in my thesis. And that's, no word for this stuff existed. I had to invent a word. The nearest words I could use for it were like this, so we have paratext. That works. What Ian Bogost wants to talk about in Alien Phenomenology is the idea of philosophy through action, which is not to say philosophy that's about writing down philosophy or making papers for these things, but is rather about the much more explicit relationship between what you think and your model of the universe and the things you make. So, philosophy as expressed through baking, philosophy as expressed through motorcycle repair. And this is a really interesting idea, one that I used in my thesis and will be using hopefully in further writing, with the idea of games as philosophy engines. You can craft a game in such a way that in order to play it, a person has to get their mindset more or less in line with some value or idea or argument of yours. Effectively, you are using a game to spread a philosophy, and people will want to engage with and play the game because it's fun, but that will mean that they also have in some way internalized a component of your philosophy without necessarily having meant to. And that's kind of cool. I find that a really interesting idea, and honestly, philosophy engine is a pretty dope sounding name for a thing. What Bogost decided to call this idea of crafting leading to philosophy is carpentry, which is a little bit annoying when one of the things you can do to express philosophy, according to him, under the model of carpentry, is actual carpentry. And when the time comes to make academic language, one of the things you want to do is make it so that the language is unambiguous. When you're using carpentry to describe carpentry and carpentry, you have already made your language ambiguous. And that's really annoying. Now, there's also to some degree a certain cringe when it comes to this stuff, because games in general, and in academia, and video games, which is where Bogost comes from, tend to have this problem of not being taken seriously, not being treated as proper, worthy academic topics. An idea that we don't do a lot to dissuade. So when he coins this term, carpentry, and describes, his model of a world where these are important, meaningful conversations to have, it can often feel a little bit like he's trying to kind of borrow the prominence that we give to handcrafted objects with his description of philosophy as carpentry. Now, that's a somewhat uncharitable discussion of the idea, and he doesn't necessarily mean that, but it is a thing that kind of hovers around the edges of the senses when you read his book. So, we're talking about definitions now. When it comes to sport, the ambiguousness is, what does sport mean? Because sports aren't just games. Sports aren't just play for fun. Sports are something else as well. With Bernard Suit's discussion of play, of a game is the voluntary overcoming of unnecessary obstacles, which is to say, the idea at its core is that a game is something you're choosing to do, and in choosing to do it, you are somehow creating the game. So anything you choose to do for fun that you don't have to do is a game. It might not be a very complicated game, it might not be a very good game, it might be a really bad game, but it's still a game. In the book The Grasshopper, Life, Games, and Utopia, from whence we get this definition and where I get the bulk of my thesis, Suits describes that even someone whose game is to see how quickly they can get home via various routes of walking is racing the sun, and that is itself the obstacle. The obstacle is comparison of their efficiency compared to themselves at a different time. So the idea of this idea of play, this model of play, is tied in with what Suits then goes on to describe as the losery attitude, which is basically play feel, the willingness to set aside seriousness and the necessary in the name of the unnecessary. Basically, not necessarily doing things for fun, but doing things for play. And this is an interesting and challenging kind of point of the discussion, because we are often left with the idea that sport is a way that we legitimize play. Like, if I told my parents that I was playing a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh, for example, they probably would have not had a wild positive opinion about that. But if I told them that I was, entered into the Yu-Gi-Oh championships and I was in the running for winning, I don't know what the prize pots are like for Yu-Gi-Oh. So this was a really bad example. I regret this decision. But that idea all flowed together. All that idea space flows in connection to the sport element, the competitive play, and the incentivization through money, legitimizing the rest of what it was I was doing. Which is, I actually think that's really crass, and I think it's awful. Like, it doesn't matter if playing tennis makes you happy. You've got to play tennis well enough to be good at it for anyone to give a dang or legitimize it as a component of your life. This is something that hopefully we're getting past. But millennial culture is killing blank tends to tie into these awful ideas that, well, just because you're doing it for fun or doing it because you like it, we've got to find some way to attach shame to that. Because that's what a lot of millennials are doing is. Millennials aren't buying enough diamonds or aren't buying enough houses because, they're spending money on avocados. And like, those two things are in no way connected at all. But it does mean you get to attach shame to the idea of having some nice toast. By the way, a friend of mine had a tweet go extremely viral where she pointed out just how messed up it is that the idea of luxury that they're chiding the millennials for is having some veggies on toast, and then had to deal with months of people correcting her about, well, actually an avocado is a fruit. It's like, well, thanks. But the conversation about, rightness of play and, justifying play is still there. This is the idea of a sport is a game for money. But then you run into that connected problem of, hang on, if a game is the voluntary overcoming of obstacles that are unnecessary, what then do you do about sport where people are compensated for it? Is sport different from a game? Does a sport stop being a game? And this is one of the areas where Suits provides where Suits became bedrock of what's known as the philosophy of sport, which is basically just grappling with that question. What counts as a sport? So, for example, is Magic the Gathering a sport? Many people would say no, because it's not athletic. On the other hand, there are plenty of conventional sports that aren't athletic. I mean, trial shooting is a sport, according to the Olympics. So that kind of depends on who you listen to, and I obviously am not exactly wild about anything that you conventionally consider a sport. I don't have a problem with any of it, it's just none of it really blows my hair back, and I don't find it particularly interesting to analyze, especially given the way that a lot of them are given like a massive amount of cultural precedence, cultural credence and cachet. Like, the idea that somehow playing a game about fairies and elves is that's not legitimate, but instead watching a group of people who have almost all been accused correctly of sexual assault try and get a leather ball into a cardboard box is somehow much more legitimate. Like, that idea really frustrates me. And, still, the question of how we define a sport tends to tie back to that loser attitude, especially because when you're being compensated for play, does it stop being play? That's not something that's easily answerable. I personally do feel that you can continue making it play, because I don't feel compensation is part of making something voluntary. Now, part of what's going on in Life Games and Utopia by Suits is it's a little bit communist and utopian. Like, one of the ideas at the core of it is that if we just sort everything in society out, everyone will be able to play all the time. And you may think that, well, you know, that's automation, Star Trek style nonsense where no one will ever have to do anything they don't want to do. And it's not quite. It is close, though. The idea at the crux of the Suits argument is that everything we do to someone might be a kind of play. There are people who enjoy building cabinets. It is to them relaxing and comforting and soothing. But we don't have a society set up to find the people who want to make cabinets and reward them for making cabinets. We have a system that's set up for finding people who can put up with the labor conditions of cabinet making for N hours a day, and that's how we handle this. We don't handle... I don't get... you know, things get success based on random facts of capitalistic marketing. You know, there are many, many inadequately unworthy works that are very, very successful by all metrics of capitalism that are nonetheless kind of just bad. And, you know, you can then take the argument that, well, the market has determined that they are in fact good, so they are not bad. And that's nice, but I prefer a little more thought about what constitutes quality. I tend to view it in terms of, does it make people happy? Are there people who actively enjoy it? So I'm not saying, you know, oh, pulp media is all trash. I'm saying that there is a problem with how we define this stuff if we're defining it in terms of capitalist success. And in Suits' model of the world, what will happen is everyone who wants to do a thing will find the way to do that thing. That there is a totally reasonable distribution of population and labor that leaves us with only the people who want to make cabinets making cabinets. Now, Marshall Rosenberg, in Principles of Nonviolent Communication, touches on this to an extent, with the idea that there's a lot of stuff that we're told and conditioned we must do that we don't actually must do. That there is actually a lot of stuff that we do because we are violently conditioned into doing it. Not just violence by force, but like the very method of communication we use has violence baked into it, which means that we talk about things in a way that is violent, and part of that leads to this assumption that something is someone's fault, that it matters, that who's right and who's wrong is primary of importance, and that deservedness is very important. So anyone who's getting successful or has a career or is making money in a way that isn't worthy under what Marshall Rosenberg calls jackal speak is wrong and bad, and that we need to find some way to limit and punish them. This idea is pretty harmful, and it's why we get this situation where a whole bunch of people wind up doing jobs they hate for their whole lives. Whereas there's something they want to do and there's something they love to do, but we don't let them do it. Or rather, we don't reward them for doing it. And in a system where everyone's got to pay basically money for being alive, that's kind of it. You kind of have the whole ball game gone if you have to do stuff that you hate doing. It's a really interesting idea of what constitutes freedom, what I believe LBJ referred to as freedom from want and freedom from fear. Two ideas that we are obviously not wild about anymore. Because, you know, want is how we successfully manipulate people into getting stuff that they don't need, and fear is how we drive politics. Anyway, I might have the wrong president there. I'm afraid it was. I thought it was the gentleman who introduced the New Deal, but you know, pick the accent. I'm not from around these parts. The idea of a society where everyone gets to play all the time does promote the idea of all these people who want to do something frivolous with their time, like, you know, everyone's a Let's Player. And there's a certain... And our current model, by the way, has made it so that that's really flawed because, you know, not everyone can be a Let's Player. There's just not enough money in the environment to be a Let's Player. You've got to have enough of an audience to justify doing it. Now, that's also kind of flawed because, as it stands, if there are 16 million people and they all watch a bit of each other's Let's Plays, then you've got a successful market of 16 million Let's Players because they're all included in the ad revenue for one another. But that's also basing on the idea that ad revenue works, which it doesn't. The current model for society is therefore built around this wonderful lie of meritocracy, that people who are good at things get to do those things. And that's it. That's it. We're done. We don't need to explain it. There's no way. That's what leads to these breathless conversations about, I can't believe these people spent $16 million developing a juicer that's not very good. Because why is that a surprise? Like, building a juicer is hard, and building a juicer, if you've never made a juicer, is hard. Why in the world would that be in any way interesting? And the idea is that if you have $16 million to spend on it, someone would have either stopped you spending that money, or you would only get that money if you were capable of delivering it. So the Juicero, which I'm referencing, is kind of like this symbol of Silicon Valley excess. This idea of like, why are we giving these people so much money that they don't even know how to use it? And, you know, that's a very real problem because a lot of Silicon Valley style stuff ties into this big problem of advertising, which is the primary thing advertising is there to sell you isn't the product they're advertising, it's the idea of advertising. That's what advertisers are good at. They're not good at selling... Like, advertisers can't tell you about my games, advertisers can't make you want my games, but advertisers can tell people who take them very seriously that with these charts and this much money, we were able to successfully monetize and fractionalize this quarter's 14th whatchamacallits. And, you know, here's a correlation between sales of your product and our marketing efforts, which is almost even made more awkward by the fact that there is, to some extent, a really important element of marketing that advertising does, which is let people know things exist. Because that's one of the things that you'll find. Pepsi Max. I drink Pepsi Max, so it's what I thought of as the default product. But no, PepsiCo and Coca-Cola have the same model of advertising, which is, it's basically the John McCain Iraq War strategy. It's be everywhere all the time, forever. Coke is omnipresent. Coke will get into every single different piece of media marketing product it can get. It will advertise on everything it can. And you'll notice if you look at Coke ads, they're very rarely telling you anything about Coke. They'll tell you it's a drink, and they'll tell you that it's refreshing, and that's usually all they care about telling you. Because they don't have to tell you more than that. That's all Coke really needs to do. They need to make sure that you can remember Coke exists in every situation where it could be meaningful. Coke is a thing that exists. And that's all they got. And that's all they need to have. Because it means that you are aware of Coke and you think of Coke as normal. Normalcy is a big thing that advertisers want. They want everything they do to be accepted and part of being normal. Which is part of what made that whole Pepsi protest video so weird and so sad. Not because Pepsi are thinking they'll solve the problem. No, that's not how Pepsi advertised. Pepsi advertised that way because they thought, well, everyone's going to be protesting all the time now. Let's make ourselves normal in a protest. They might say, oh no, we wanted to be part of fixing things, but that's not really how they do it. That's not how that particular marketing model works. Just a grain of salt there, Pepsi. So, what we're presented with then is this worldview where right now we have a hard time envisioning the notion that everyone would be playing all the time because you're not necessarily used to seeing as normal someone who likes their job. That's weird, isn't it? Like you could think about in media, like the trope is such and such hates their job, and you know, from thence flows comedy. It's overwhelmingly the way that comedy gets framed. Think about all the long-standing franchises and TV series and media things that show you a person at work. They're all about how much it sucks in a really purgatorial way. Like, you know, yeah, it sucks, but this is what we got. No one's leaving, no one's changing, no one's unionizing. This is just how we endure. Dilbert is a great example of this, by the way. A piece of media that convinces the office sop that, you know, oh yes, I'm part of the intelligent elite dealing with the utter dunderheads and ninnies, when odds are really good. You're just as much of a ninny as your boss is. It's just your boss is getting paid much more than you are to do a job they don't understand all that well either. And that is a problem you will see in a lot of management positions, especially if you've got a manager who just seems to want to chime in on anything, even if they don't really seem to know what they're talking about. And it's kind of weird. This is because your manager doesn't know what their job is either. They don't know how to do their job. They don't know what matters in their job and your job. They just know that they're managing. So they've got to manage. And the net result of that is this really weird... bother. The net result of that is this really weird and embarrassing kind of middle space where someone whose job is technically much higher pay grade than yours is contacting you at the middle of work to say, hey, by the way, did you put those things on the shelf the way that anyone with your job would remember to do? There are people who, if you could let them, if the work was respected and they weren't treated like garbage for it, would absolutely love to just work at McDonald's the rest of their lives. That would be completely cool for them. Maybe not McDonald's specifically, but the idea of simple, low responsibility, generally fun, you know, low friction interactions with people kind of thing. There is nothing about a McDonald's job that has to suck. It sucks because people treat you badly. It sucks because people are bad to that kind of worker. And that shows a lot about what we respect. Like, why is it that being nice to a worker in a fast food job is seen as being somehow special to them? Why is it seen as like, oh, you're doing them a favor by being kind? Like, they're human. Be kind to them. That's kind of like just a general principle for life. Why would you actively want there to be people in work positions around you, especially ones who are handing your food, who have to expect to be miserable sometimes? Isn't that just asking for problems? Isn't that just begging for a situation where someone who is going to be entitled to handle your food has every reason to want to spit in it? And for that matter, isn't it just beneath dignity of people that we have jobs where we view accepting abuse is a fundamental part of them? This is something we accept in our society. We just accept the idea that abuse is normal and being abused is acceptable. And that's disgusting and sad. Oh, and there we go. I hope you had fun.